Tonight, I wanted to do something just a tad bit spookier for the start of the fall season. And so, we'll be stepping into the darkened halls of Middle-earth's history, where the Witch-King of Angmar and his ominous Ringwraiths reside. This is a tale about fear, power, and corruption, of the inescapable pool of darkness that can twist even the noblest beings. The Witch-King, alongside the Ringwraiths, or Nazgul, as they're also known, are the embodiment of dread. I distinctly remember how it felt seeing them for the first time when I was younger, the quiet terror that instilled, and how they came to represent an element of dark fantasy that I've adored since. We're going to explore the legacy, the enigma of the Witch-King. Who was he really? How did he come to wield so much power? And in what manner did he meet his fated demise? Then afterwards, I'm going to read some bits from the various chapters in Tolkien's books, the ones that feature the Witch-King and the Ringwraiths in some form, along with their most iconic appearances or lines. So gather close, let the firelight chase away the chill. There's much to discover, and as always, we'll do it together, with a keen eye, a brave heart, and just the right amount of curiosity. And if you'd like to support my little quest to Mordor, consider joining my Patreon and leaving some Lember's bread for the road. Now, as we prepare to journey into this tale of darkness and despair, I invite you to find a place of comfort and warmth. Maybe you have a favorite chair by the fire, or a cozy corner with a view of the night sky. Whether you are a seasoned traveler of Middle-earth or a newcomer to its wonders, we will set off on a fellowship of our own, exploring the very paths where Frodo and his friends once walked, and sometimes hid from the shadowy Nazgul. As you settle in, perhaps with a warm cup of tea or something stronger, take a moment to let the weight of the day slip away. Close your eyes if you like, and let the soft glow of the fire and the gentle sound of my voice guide you. Let your mind wander back to the ancient lands of Middle-earth. Imagine the vast plains of Rohan, the towering peaks of the Misty Mountains, and the dark forests of Mirkwood. For it is in these lands that the Nazgul once roam. Picture yourself with Frodo and the hobbits huddled in that small, dimly lit room, with Strider watching over them, the only light coming from the steady ember of his tobacco pipe. Outside, the wind howls, and the trees creak in the darkness, their branches clawing at the windows like the twisted hands of the wraiths they dread. The world outside must have felt distant, almost unreal, as if they had been transported to another time and place. But with Strider by their side, there was still a sliver of hope, however faint, to hold on to. Feel the earth beneath your feet as you move quietly through the underbrush, mirroring Strider's every move. Together, you follow the faint traces left behind by the hobbits. The broken twig here, a footprint there, knowing they are just ahead, hiding from the Black Riders. You can almost hear the rustle of leaves, the distant thumps from the hooves of their beasts, and the low murmur of a hidden stream. The tension hangs heavy as you and Strider keep your focus, aware that the Nazgul could be just around the corner, ready to strike. Now fully immersed, let us begin this journey together. And may the light of Arundel's star guide us as we venture into the shadows of Middle-earth. Our story begins long before Sauron rose to the height of his power, in an age when Middle-earth was still young and full of wonder. It was a time of great beauty, when the elves, Ilúvatar's firstborn, the creator of all that is, lived in harmony with the world. Their cities glittered with the light of the two trees, the sacred sources of light that illuminated the land before the sun and moon existed, untouched by the shadow that would one day spread across the land. Under the guidance of the Valar, powerful beings sent by Ilúvatar to shape and govern the world, the elves had long been masters of many arts. Their skill in crafting grew to be unmatched by any other race in Middle-earth. They could shape metals and gems with such delicacy and precision that their creations seemed almost alive. Among the elves, there was one who stood out: Celebrimbor, the grandson of Fëanor. Now Fëanor, if you remember, was the greatest of all elven smiths. But he was also driven by pride, and his legacy was one of tragedy. Celebrimbor, however, was different. He inherited his grandfather's skill, but his heart was purer. He wanted to create things of beauty, to preserve the world's splendor for all time. The elves were keenly aware of the passage of time.
Though they themselves were immortal, they could see the world around them changing. And so, Celebrimbor and his kin in Eregion set out to forge something truly remarkable: the Rings of Power. These weren't just ordinary rings. They were conceived as a way to halt the decay of the world, to keep Middle-earth beautiful forever.
But as you might guess, things didn't go as planned. For even as the elves set about their work with the best of intentions, Sauron, the lieutenant of the first Dark Lord Morgoth, had not been idle. He had his own plans, and they were anything but noble. He had long sought to dominate Middle-earth and bring all its peoples under his control. It was with this goal in mind that Sauron disguised himself as Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, and approached the elves of Eregion. Annatar presented himself as a benevolent figure, one who sought only to help the elves achieve their lofty goals. He spoke of his desire to see Middle-earth flourish, and promised that, together, they could craft wonders that would stand the test of time. His words were honeyed, and his demeanor was humble. Celebrimbor and his kin, eager to learn and to create, welcomed him with open arms, not knowing that they were inviting the very architect of their downfall into their midst. Under Annatar's guidance, the elves worked tirelessly to forge the Rings of Power. But all the while, Annatar, Sauron, was subtly steering their work towards his own dark ends. Finally, after years of labor, the rings were complete. 19 in total. Each one was a masterpiece of craftsmanship and magic. But even as the elves admired their work, they knew not the depths to which they'd been deceived. Because while they had been busy in Eregion, Sauron had forged another. Tempered in the fires of Mount Doom, he crafted the One Ring to rule them all. When Sauron put on the One Ring, the elves felt it immediately. It was like a dark presence reaching out to them, trying to take control. They realized too late that they'd been betrayed. In a desperate attempt to keep their rings out of Sauron's grasp, they hid them. But the damage was done. The rings were tainted, their fate tied to the One Ring, and to Sauron's will. The 19 rings of power were divided amongst 3 groups. 3 for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, and 9 for mortal men doomed to die. Each of these rings was unique in its qualities and powers, tailored to the nature and desires of the beings who were meant to bear them. The 3 rings, known as Narya, Nenya, and Vilya, were the most powerful and pure of the rings of power. They were intended to preserve and protect, to heal the wounds of the world, and to keep alive the beauty of Middle-earth. Narya, the Ring of Fire, was meant to inspire and rekindle the spirits of those who fought against darkness. Nenya, the Ring of Water, was a symbol of protection and preservation. Its power bound to the secret places of nature. Vilya, the Ring of Air, was the mightiest of the 3, with the power to heal and to ward off evil. These rings were given to the greatest of the elves, Galadriel, Elrond, and Círdan. But so long as Sauron wielded the One Ring, they feared to use them, lest he see their thoughts. But the 7 and the 9 were different. These rings were crafted with the direct involvement of Anatar, and were far more susceptible to Sauron's influence. The 7 rings were given to the dwarf lords, the rulers of the 7 great houses. These rings were intended to bring wealth and prosperity to their bearers, amplifying their natural talent for mining and craftsmanship. And indeed, the dwarf lords who received these rings became immensely wealthy, their hoards of treasure growing to unimaginable sizes. But there was a darker side to the power of the 7. Now, by their very nature and hardness, the dwarfs were quite resistant to Sauron's direct control. But instead, they became consumed by greed and avarice. Their desire for wealth became an obsession, driving them to delve ever deeper into the earth in search of riches. This greed ultimately led to the downfall of many of the great dwarven kingdoms, as they awakened things in the deep places of the world that should have remained undisturbed. The 9 rings were given to the greatest of men, kings, sorcerers, and warriors of immense power and ambition. The rings granted them great power, of course, extending their lives far beyond their natural span, essentially immortalizing them. But the rings also eroded their wills, corrupting their hearts and minds until they were no longer men, but wraiths, shadows of their former selves, bound to the will of Sauron for all eternity. These are the men who, through a long and painful process, would become known as the Ringwraiths, or Nazgul. I want to talk a little more about the process of this transformation. The inherent weakness of men is a theme that runs throughout most, if not all, of Tolkien's works, and it's rather clear to see why. Unlike the elves, who are already immortal, and unlike the dwarves, who are naturally hardy and resistant, men's lives are short, fleeting, and often filled with the unknown. It is this fear makes them particularly susceptible to the allure of power and the promise of immortality. a promise that the rings of power offered in abundance. The process of their transformation into Ringwraiths was gradual, with multiple stages of corruption. But perhaps, through sheer ambition and folly, the kings of men did not notice the dark power feeding off of their doubts and fear until they were consumed by it. At first, the ring-bearers experienced only the benefits of their newfound power. They grew stronger, wiser, more influential. Their kingdoms flourished under their rule, and their subjects revered them as near gods. But as time passed, the darker aspects of the rings began to assert themselves. They had vivid dreams, filled with images of shadowy figures and dark landscapes. They heard whispers in the night, voices that spoke of power and glory, but also of fear and despair. The bearers of the 9 rings found themselves increasingly drawn to these visions, their thoughts consumed by the promise of even greater power. They became obsessed with their own ambitions, willing to do anything to achieve their goals, even if it meant sacrificing their morals and their humanity. As the years passed, the bearers of the 9 rings became increasingly detached from the world of the living. Their bodies began to fade, becoming ghostly and insubstantial. They could no longer feel the warmth of the sun or the coolness of the night air. Food and drink brought them no pleasure, and the company of others became a source of irritation rather than comfort. They retreated into their strongholds, isolating themselves from their subjects and surrounding themselves with darkness. And with that came the paranoia and distrust, seeing enemies and conspiracies where there were none. They grew even further obsessed with their own power, to the point where they could think of nothing else. They abandoned the ideals of justice and honor that had once guided them, replacing them with a ruthless desire for control and anything to maintain their power, even if it meant betraying those who had once been their friends and allies. With the slow erosion of their will, one by one, they fell prey to the delusions and visions sent by Sauron. No longer able to distinguish between their own ambitions and those of the Dark Lord. The phantoms and horrors they saw twisted them, and in time, the ring-bearer's transformation into the Nazgul was complete. Straddling the line between the realm of shadow and the living, they were no longer men, but wraiths, creatures of shadow and darkness. Their bodies were completely insubstantial. The only ones who could perceive them in this unseen state were the elves from the Undying Lands, of which there were few, the Maya such as Sauron and the wizards, and any who wore the One Ring. And with their transformation into the Ringwraiths, they became mere instruments of Sauron's terrible will, compelled to carry out his orders without question. With the Ringwraiths being bound to Sauron, this also meant that while he was weak, the Nazgul too were powerless. But while the Dark Lord gathered power, theirs grew immensely in turn, to the point where the Witch-King of Angmar, who we'll talk about next, is said to have rivaled Gandalf the White. The tale of the Witch-King of Angmar is one shrouded in mystery and fear, his true name lost to the ages, buried under centuries of darkness and despair. Yet, fragments of his story linger, whispered across the ages. He was once a mighty sorcerer and a king, a man of great power and ambition, whose path led him into the deep and perilous ways of dark law. Some say he was of the Númenóreans, those men who hailed from the blessed Isle of Númenor, gifted to them by the Valar as a reward for their valor in the ancient wars against Morgoth, the first Dark Lord. The Númenóreans were a people of pride and might, blessed with long life and wisdom beyond the reckoning of lesser men. But within Númenor, as within all great realms, there were those whose hearts grew cold and whose minds turned to darker purposes. In the Second Age, many among them fell under the shadow of Sauron, becoming known as the Black Númenóreans. These men were ensnared by the lies and promises of the Dark Lord, their souls twisted by greed and the lust for power. It was among those corrupted that Sauron discerned the potential for great malice in one sorcerer of particular skill. To this man, Sauron offered one of the rings of power, and over the years he was transformed from a king of men into a wraith. His identity erased, his will entirely subsumed by Sauron's. He became the Witch-King of Angmar, the greatest and most feared of all the Ringwraiths. He would set about enacting his master's long vengeance upon the realms in exile of the Dúnedain, the descendants of the faithful of Númenor, who had escaped its destruction, and who subsequently brought him low with the last alliance. And so, he set his sights to the north. Before we start talking about Angmar and the conquest of the north, I want to speak a little bit on the actual appearance of the Witch King, and what sort of weapons and fell beasts he and the Ringwraiths had in their arsenal. Clad in robes of pure darkness, the Witch King's appearance was a twisted, darkened reflection of the great power he once held in life. His form was shrouded in shadow, with a crown that hovered upon his invisible head, a symbol of his lost kingship, now perverted by the will of Sauron. Even his mere presence struck horrific fear into the hearts of armies. And with looks like that, how could it not have? But he also had the Morgul blade, a weapon as cursed as the one who bore it. To be struck by this blade was to invite a slow and agonizing transformation. The shard would embed itself in the victim's flesh, working its way ever closer to the heart, turning them into a lesser sort of wraith, a servant bound forever to the dark will of the Witch King. It was less so a weapon of death, and more a tool designed to rob its victim of their very soul. It was this very same blade that was used to wound Frodo on Weathertop, and it took the help of Elrond in Rivendell to heal the Morgul wound. There was also the Black Breath, a deadly miasma that the Witch King and the Ringwraiths exhaled, sapping strength and hope from those around. Their breath was poisonous, and that cursed blight caused people to fall into a dark, cold sleep, and maybe even never recover. The 9 rode black horses of nightmare, a far cry from the noble steeds of the free peoples of Middle-earth. These horses were bred and twisted by dark sorcery, making them tireless, fearless, and swift. During the latter years of the Third Age, during the War of the Ring, these horses were swept away by a flood. And so Sauron gifted his Nazgûl with dread mounts, fell beasts known as Blackwings. These creatures had come from an older world, perhaps even surviving from the elder days. They were fed corrupted meat and bred to be as fearsome as the wraiths who rode atop them. But getting back on track, let's talk about the founding of Angmar, the Witch King's fortress. The northern reaches of Middle-earth, particularly the vast and storied lands of Eriador and Arnor, were once vibrant centers of Númenórean culture and power. Arnor, in its prime, stood as a mighty kingdom, founded by Elendil the Tall and his sons after the cataclysmic downfall of Númenor. It was a land of gentle hills and ancient forests, of lofty mountains and swift-flowing rivers, a realm of beauty, majesty, and deep-rooted heritage. Yet, as the ages wore on and the shadow in the east grew, the kingdom of Arnor fell into decline. Internal strife and the ambitions of lesser lords fractured the great realm into three smaller and weaker kingdoms: Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rudor. This division, born of pride and discord, left the once united kingdom vulnerable to the encroaching darkness, a weakness that the Witch King of Angmar was quick to perceive and eager to exploit. Far to the north of these beleaguered lands, beyond the Etemors and the high passes of the Misty Mountains, lay a desolate and forsaken region known as Angmar. This was a realm of bitter winds and barren plains. Few ventured into this inhospitable wilderness, and fewer still returned to tell the tale. It was in this grim place that the Witch King chose to establish his dominion. Angmar, with its natural fortifications and strategic position, offered the perfect base from which to strike at the heart of the weakened northern kingdoms, while staying hidden from the vigilant eyes of the elves and the Dunedain. In building his fell kingdom, the Witch King summoned all the dark and malevolent forces at his command. Orcs and trolls crept down from the mountains. Wargs and wolves prowled out of the wilds, and men whose hearts had long been corrupted by the shadow answered his call. They flocked to Angmar, drawn by the promise of power and the opportunity to serve the most feared of their lord's servants. The capital of Angmar was established at Carndum, a fortress built into the mountains in the far west of the region. Carndum was a dark citadel where the forces of darkness gathered to do the Witch King's bidding. The fortress was surrounded by high walls and deep chasms, with only a few narrow passes leading to its gates. Within its walls, the Witch King's sorcerers and generals plotted the downfall of Arnor, while his armies marshaled for the coming war. The Witch King himself resided in Carndum, from where he ruled his kingdom with an iron fist. His power was greatest in Angmar, where the land bent to his will. The skies above the fortress were often darkened by storm clouds, and the air acrid with the stench of death and decay. Those who dared to enter his realm were met with unspeakable horrors, as the Witch King's magic twisted the natural world into something malevolent. Now, the war waged by the Witch King of Angmar against the northern kingdoms of Arnor was not a swift conquest, but rather a remorseless campaign, spanning many centuries. He did not want merely to subjugate these realms, but to obliterate them utterly, erasing their memory from the chronicles of Middle-earth. At the outset, the Witch King set about weakening the three sundered realms of Arnor. In Rudor, the line of the Dunedain had long since failed, and the land had fallen under the sway of lesser lords, easily seduced by promises of power. It was here that the Witch-King first gained his foothold, placing a puppet upon the throne and fortifying the land with his own forces and other foul creatures drawn to his dark banner. With Rudor under his dominion, he turned his gaze upon Cardolan. Though stronger than its sister realm, Cardolan had been grievously weakened by war and plague. The Witch-King's agents crept into its courts, spreading lies and sowing mistrust. Soon the kingdom found itself besieged on all sides, its people weary and demoralized, unable to withstand the relentless onslaught. The Witch-King's sorcery added to their misery, and he sent wights to haunt the barrows, driving the living to madness and despair. In the end, Cardolan was laid waste, its cities and fortresses reduced to rubble. With Cardolan in ruins and Rudor in thrall, the Witch-King turned his full wrath upon Arthedain, the last stronghold of Númenórean power in the north. This realm, ruled by the line of Isildur, the great king who cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand, had long resisted the encroaching darkness, but now it stood alone against the might of Angmar. The Witch-King gathered his forces at Carndum, and his army, vast and terrible, descended upon Arthedain in a series of brutal raids. The final blow came in the year 1974 of the Third Age at the Battle of Fornost. Fornost, the ancient capital of Arthedain, was a city of great strength and beauty, built by the Númenóreans in the days of their glory. But the Witch-King knew that if Fornost fell, the last hope of Arnor would be extinguished. Clad in black armor, his form wreathed in shadow, he led his armies against the city. The Dunedain fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. One by one, the gates fell, and the Witch-King's minions poured into the city. Thus Fornost fell, and with it the last vestige of the North Kingdom. The Witch-King's victory was complete, and the once proud realm of Arnor was no more. Its lands left in darkness, and its people scattered to the winds. The light of Númenor had been extinguished in the north. But the triumph of the Witch-King did not last. Even as darkness fell over the north, hope was rekindled in the hearts of free folk. The remnants of Arnor, led by the steadfast Dunedain, took refuge in the hidden valleys and wooded hills, waging a silent war of resistance against their oppressor. To their aid came the elves of Lindon and Rivendell, and from the south marched the valiant men of Gondor, who had not forgotten their kinship with the north. Thus, a great alliance was forged to challenge the might of Angmar. In the year after Fornost's fall, this host advanced northward under the command of Erna, Prince of Gondor. Upon the plains near the ruined city, they met the armies of the Witch-King in a battle terrible and bitter. The field ran red with the blood of men and orcs alike, but the resolve of the free peoples did not waver. Erna, in his wisdom, dispatched a swift cavalry force into the hills of Evendim, where they lay concealed. As the battle raged below, These horsemen swept down upon the enemy's flank like a storm unleashed, throwing the ranks of Angmar into chaos and despair. In the middle of all this mess, the Witch-King sought to flee northward to his stronghold of Carndum. But from Rivendell came Glorfindel, the hero of old, whose might was undimmed by the passage of ages. Leading a host of elven warriors, they fell upon the retreating foe, and in that hour the Witch-King himself appeared, dark and fell, mounted upon a sable steed. He rode against Erna, and such was his dreadful visage that the prince's horse reared in terror, carrying its rider away despite his will. The Witch-King laughed, a sound cold and cruel, but his mirth was short-lived. Glorfindel approached, his presence radiant and fearsome. On his white horse, the elf lord bore down upon the black-clad wraith, and the Witch-King, sensing the might arrayed against him, turned and fled into the shadows. None saw where he went, and in the darkness he vanished without a trace. Erna, eager to pursue and finish what had been started, was held back by Glorfindel, who spoke the words that made his famous prophecy. "Do not pursue him. He will not return to these lands. Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man shall he fall." Thus ended the reign of Angmar. The north was free, though scarred and desolate, and the kingdoms of old did not rise again. The Dunedain became a wandering people, keeping secret watch over the lands they once ruled. The elves bore their own losses, but found solace in the victory achieved. As for the Witch-King, he fled to Mordor, where darker designs awaited him. Though Sauron yet concealed himself in Dol Guldur, known only as the Necromancer, the 9 Ringwraiths gathered once more in the Black Land. There they labored to rebuild their master's strength, mustering hosts of orcs and creatures of shadow, preparing for the time when the Dark Lord would rise anew and cast his shadow over all Middle-earth. In the year 2000 of the Third Age, the Ringwraiths emerged from Mordor, their black banners flying as they set their sights on Gondor, a kingdom weakened by the ravages of the Great Plague and the Wainrider invasion. The Witch-King led the assault, laying siege to the fortified city of Minas Ithil. After 2 years of relentless siege, the city fell to the Nazgul, who claimed it as their own. From that time onward, it was known as Minas Morgul, the Tower of Sorcery, a place steeped in the darkest of magics, where shadows whispered of ancient evils. As time passed, the Witch-King's old foe, Ernal, ascended to the throne of Gondor upon the death of his father, King Ernal. The Witch-King, ever vengeful and seeking to settle old scores, challenged the new king to single combat. Erna, remembering his past encounter with the Witch-King, refused the challenge, perhaps sensing the trap that lay within. But 7 years later, the challenge was issued again, and this time Erna could not resist. Filled with pride and anger, remembering his humiliation at their last encounter,
he rode out from Minas Tirith to face the Witch-King at Minas Morgul. There in the shadow of the accursed tower, he vanished, and none saw him again. With his disappearance, the line of kings of Gondor came to an end, and the rule of
The stewards began a time of great uncertainty for the kingdom. The Witch-King, having claimed yet another victory, retreated to his dark tower. Soon after, Sauron, still only known as the Necromancer, fled Dol Guldur to avoid the investigations of Gandalf and hid in the east. And the Nazgul remained quiet, biding their time in Minas Morgul as a constant, lurking threat that would endure for the next 400 years. And in the year 2951 of the Third Age, Sauron cast aside all pretense and declared himself openly. He was bent on reclaiming the One Ring, the source of his power. So began the hunt, and the Nazgul, relentless as death, rode forth once more across the wide lands of Middle-earth. The War of the Ring was the final chapter in the long and bloody history of the Ringwraiths. It was during this time that Gollum, a wretched creature, twisted by the long years of possession of the ring, was captured. Through torment and the art of dark questioning, Sauron extracted from him the tale of how the ring had passed into his hands, then lost. But Gollum's words were misinterpreted by the Dark Lord, leading him to believe that the ring lay hidden near the Gladden Fields, where Gollum had once dwelled. So Sauron dispatched the Nine, led by the Witch-King, to scour the lands of Eriador in search of his precious prize. Kamal, the lieutenant of the Witch-King, scoured the vales of Anduin. But the land known as the Shire eluded him. Undeterred, the Witch-King drove his forces north and west. But soon Sauron's gaze was diverted by events in Gondor and the treachery of Saruman, who sought the ring for himself. The Ringwraiths were sent to Isengard, where Saruman, with cunning words, deceived them into believing that Gandalf alone knew the whereabouts of the ring. Resuming their search, the Witch-King and his wraiths came upon the traitorous Wormtongue, who spoke of Gandalf's passage through the Shire, and even of Saruman's betrayal. His life was spared, for the Witch-King foresaw Saruman's downfall at Wormtongue's hands. The Nine then captured spies of Saruman, discovering maps of the Shire, and with them renewed hope in their dark quest. At Sarn Ford, the Ringwraiths encountered the Dúnedain Rangers, valiant guardians of the North, who sought to hold them at bay. But the power of the Nazgul was too great, and the Rangers were overcome, with only a few escaping to warn their chieftain, Aragorn. But even as the Whigs entered the Shire, the One Ring had already passed into the hands of Frodo Baggins, a hobbit. One of Saruman's former spies, now in service to the Witch-King, saw Frodo vanish in a tavern, and reported as such. And so the Witch-King pursued the ring-bearer to Weathertop, where he struck Frodo with a Morgul blade, wounding him terribly. Though driven back by Aragorn's bravery, the Ringwraiths continued their pursuit to Rivendell until they were swept away downstream by the waters of the Bruinen, summoned by the elf Elrond's command. Defeated but not destroyed, the Witch-King returned to Mordor, where he prepared for the eventual grand assault upon Gondor. Leading the hosts of Minas Morgul, he shattered the gates of Minas Tirith, only to be met by Gandalf upon Shadowfax, who stood against him. the Witch-King rode his fell beast into the thick of the battle, where he turned his malice upon King Theoden of Rohan, striking him down. But Eowyn, the shield maiden of Rohan and the king's niece, disguised as a soldier, fulfilled the ancient prophecy, for she was no man, and she slew the Witch-King with the help of the hobbit, Merry Brandybuck. And so it came to be that the greatest servant of Sauron was vanquished, and the tide of the battle of the Pelennor Fields turned, heralding the beginning of the end for the Dark Lord's dominion.